Good morning, everyone. This is the last lesson before the Easter holidays. Now, I will give you some homework to do during the break on Friday, most likely some sort of mock exam to complete. But for today, we will just keep talking about the American Civil War and what kind of consequences the war had on the southern population. This one is a big boy question, trademark, which is worth 16 marks, yes. And this means one thing. It's an easy way to pick up points and raise your score. If you see one of those big boy questions, the usual reaction I saw in your mocks is that you were scared. You didn't write anything because, oh God, it's the big question. The thing is that you risk nothing, okay? It's a natural response, but it's not very effective. You see, those questions are like bears and wild animals. They're more scared of you than you are of them. Just write something vaguely related to the question. Really, anything goes. If the question also has spelling points, that's usually 3 or 4 marks you can get by just writing a mediocre answer in proper English. But of course, we don't want mediocrity, we want excellence, and we can achieve it. So, long story short, don't leave in blank, improvise your way to a passing grade. Better still if you write something that makes sense. Without further ado, let's get to it. What kind of question is this? This is a factors question, okay? Like the big one in Health and the People, it asks you to consider certain factors, in this case the consequences of the Civil War, and decide in which category of factors was the most important. To answer this question, you will have to A. Consider both bullet points of the question, so both the socio-economic and political consequences. B. Support your point with as many examples as possible. I cannot stress this enough. C. Show an ability to understand the context. And D. Possibly, if you can, that would be excellent, frame everything as a coherent and logically sound argument. This is what I try to do in the model answer, and in this lesson my argument will be that the political decisions taken by the winners of the war provided the foundation for the wider economic and social changes. They changed the rules of the game, in a way. Without those political changes, the southern economy and society, maybe it would not have changed that much, or maybe they would have changed in a different way. Of course, you are more than free to disagree, and I'm actually encouraging you to think of a better argument if you can and justify it. I'm curious what you can come up with. Seriously. So, moving on. What should you write in the answer? Before we get into detail, we need some fundamental background for those who didn't know or didn't care. On the 9th of April 1865, the Union won the war. The southern armies of General Lee capitulated after a long and frankly unexpected resistance, which showed everyone around the world what a small but well-led force could achieve against a much larger and better supplied enemy, which was led by people who were not incompetent but not necessarily geniuses. There were some people, of course, who didn't give up, like those Japanese Japanese soldiers who kept fighting after Second World War. The Civil War had this sort of things. There was the crew of a ship called the Shenandoah, which kept fighting and sinking northern ships around the globe, literally everywhere from India to Alaska, until the 6th of November, so several months after the end of the Civil War. And finally, they gave up and surrendered, not to the federal government, but to the British, because they still didn't recognize the authority of the former enemies. But they lost. The territory was occupied by northern troops, and the states were integrated into the Union. If you remember, they had tried to secede, they tried to leave, but the United States are a lot like Hotel California. You can check out any time you like, but you can never leave. Now, the defeat of the Confederates was, of course, an extremely consequential event which affected all aspects of life in the southern states. It was the defeat in a huge and terrible war, which we discussed last time. We can categorize the major consequences into two categories following the exam question: the political consequences and the social and economic consequences. In the political consequences, we're talking about the new amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, and the Compromise of 1877. In the social and economic consequences, we're talking about the end of the slave economy, the liberation of the slaves, the Negro codes, and the carpetbaggers and occupying troops. So let's look at them one by one. First, the constitutional amendments. In 1863, Abraham Lincoln famously issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared that all the states in the Confederate territories were now free. If a black slave was able to escape from the South and reach the North, he or she would be considered free. Yay! This proclamation was enforced onto the southern states after the defeat in 1865. A few months after the victory of the Union, a long process of drafting and putting together constitutional amendments started in the US Congress in Washington. Before we continue, two key concepts. First, a constitution is the fundamental guide of a country, the fundamental law of a country, the document that describes how the states work, the state, the country, the government works, what are the rights of the citizens, and so on. Constitutions tend to be very respected documents, okay? The United Kingdom does not have a written constitution. It's one of the very few countries in the world that doesn't. It's weird. As always, Britain is its own thing. But most countries do, and in most countries, it's a very respected document. Particularly so in the United States, where the so-called American civil religion, which is another very interesting topic we can discuss, send me an email if you're interested, gave the Constitution an almost sacred value. Okay, it's like the Bible of the American state in a way. 2. An amendment is when a law, or in this case the Constitution, the fundamental law, is modified in any way. 3 amendments were passed between 1865 and 1870. The 13th Amendment, which banned slavery in the United States. The 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship to every person born in the United States, including former slaves, and the 15th Amendment, which lifted all voting restrictions based on race or other factors. For men, we still have to wait until the 1920s or 30s for women. Now, if you want to learn more, there is a video in the transcript. Within 5 years, what was the effect of these amendments? Within 5 years, the basic rules of social coexistence, which have shaped the life of Southern societies for 2 centuries, since the 16th and 17th centuries, were absolutely turned on the head. Let's look at the consequence of each amendment. The 13th Amendment, the one about freeing the slaves. It meant that the economy of the region could not rely on unpaid slave labor anymore. Okay, this created all sorts of problems to both the white slave owners and the former slaves themselves, and we'll see that in a moment. The 14th Amendment meant that the former slaves were considered full citizens with the same legal rights to life, liberty, and property as the whites. Before then, slaves or blacks could not own property in the southern states. You could not have things, and the testimony was often disregarded in court. For example, if a white person assaulted and beaten a black slave, the black slave could not testify in court against it. So this gave free rein to all sorts of criminal and immoral behavior against the black slaves. The fact that now they did have these legal guarantees and they now were citizens upturned an entire social order, which was based on the fact that there was a category of human beings that was legally tied into a defined inferior position. Black people are slaves, and this is what our society is based upon. Now they're not anymore, okay, everything changes. The 15th Amendment allowed them to vote and therefore to take part in the decision-making process at both a national and a state level. This, of course, had a lot of restrictions, and we'll discuss that too in a second, but it was the beginning of a black political renaissance in the South, and we even see black elected politicians in the southern states. Now, those were decisions taken by the United States Congress and enforced at a federal level by the federal government. They caused huge social changes. Okay, without these 3 amendments, without this part of the Reconstruction, the economy and the society of the South would not have happened otherwise. There could have been other decisions, there could have been other constitutional compromises. But there were these particular decisions which had overarching and very deep effects on society and the economy. However, we're going to look at the Compromise of 1877, The phase known as the radical reconstruction, in which all these sort of radical amendments that completely upturned a social order on its head, ended in the mid-1870s, as the anti-slavery enthusiasm declined and as the problem of managing an entire half of the country as an occupied foreign territory began to emerge and become clear. A very controversial election in 1876 meant that the southern states were on the verge of refusing and recognizing the authority of the new Republican president, Rutherford B. Hayes, which risked triggering another round of uprising, civil unrest, and all sorts of problems. Nobody wanted that, and especially the new government wanted the support of the South. To avoid this situation and to gain votes in Congress, okay, because the president can say, we're going to make this law, but the law needs to pass, to go through Congress, as we said a couple of weeks ago, last week actually. And if you don't have enough people in Congress to push your votes, they just don't happen. Think about what happened to Obamacare a few years ago, or about the wall on the border with Mexico right now with Trump. They might say we want to do this thing, but they don't have enough votes in Congress to do the thing. So they don't do the thing. And this happened at the time as well. They wanted enough votes in order to have a stable and effective presidential government. To do that, they asked for a favor. They asked for a compromise. They wanted to appeal to the Southern Democrats, who were the overwhelming majority in the former Confederate states, and proposed a compromise. So the federal government would get Southern Democrat support in Congress. The Southern states would get the removal of federal troops and federal personnel, new railroads, new laws to help the Southern economy get out of the crisis, and the right to deal with the black people without any interference from the North. I don't think the federal government wants this one. Now, while this was done to solve a short-term political crisis, it had huge consequences in the long term. Okay, it set the South back. Not set it back, but essentially nullified a good chunk of what was done during the first period of the reconstruction of the constitutional amendments. Most of you have heard about the Jim Crow laws, okay, those laws on racial segregation in the southern states, the ones Martin Luther King and the other members of the civil rights movements of the 1960s fought against. They start here, okay? They start in the moment the southern states get the right to decide whatever to do with the black population without any interference from the northern states, because the federal government wanted a bunch more votes to pass its legislation. Okay, a political decision with deep influences in the way society would develop for a century. Now, let's look at the economic and social consequences now. Started with the end of slavery, the end of the slave economy, and the liberation of slaves. Now, very briefly, the situation changed, but initially not too much. The slaves were poor and uneducated. Now, even with the new established freedoms and rights, they needed to find sustenance and jobs. And they couldn't, because they were poor, and therefore they could not move outside of their area, and they were not educated, and therefore they did not have the qualification required to get a better job. Some of them migrated to the north, but most of the freed slaves remained in the south, where they worked as agricultural laborers in the plantations of the former masters. This is called sharecropping. Now, the abolition of slavery meant that violent action towards them was now against the law, of course, and that as laborers they needed to be paid somehow. But this didn't really change the fact that most of the white majority was still 6 million against 3 million. Most of the 1/3 of the population was slaves, and the other 2/3 were whites. It didn't change the fact that the 2/3 of the population in the South was extremely racist towards them. Still, it didn't change the fact that they were still working as laborers, being paid next to nothing for their former masters. There are all sorts of other things that are mentioned in the notes, including the rise of the KKK and so on. So Yes, they were freed, but the freedom was not something immediate and something with a very immediate result. It is also worth noting, when talking about the economic consequences, that the plantation system collapsed, okay, almost overnight. Yes, they had sharecroppers and everything, but throughout the war, the production of cotton and therefore the number of laborers employed drastically decreased, both during the war and after the war. Then you had to pay these new people. Then the southern banking system and everything else that was linked to the plantation system, which was more or less literally everything else in the southern economy, also collapsed. It was the beginning of a very intense economic crisis that lasted until the mid-1880s. And then we got to the Negro codes. I don't know if YouTube is going to remove this video, but I'm using it in an historical context, so hopefully not. Now, even before the Compromise of 1877, the southern states had tried to use all sorts of constitutional loopholes in order to avoid recognizing or enforcing the new legal rights of the black population. Those were called Negro codes. They were often issued at a local level, county or parish, and contained numerous restrictions on what the new black citizens were allowed to do. For example, they were not allowed to carry firearms. They were not allowed to preach to congregations they were not allowed to preach to congregation of colored people without a special permission, because, of course, religious congregations could be places of political discussion, and this could create problems for the white overlords. They were required to be, this is in 1865, before the 14th and 15th Amendment, they were required to be in the regular service of some white person or former owner. They could not be independent. There was someone who had to be responsible for their conduct. And they were not allowed to rent or keep a house in certain areas. They were required to live in separate areas. Those are just some examples from a black code issued in the state of Louisiana in 1865. You can find more details in the transcript, as always. This kind of laws prospered, okay? There were many of them in literally every corner of the South, deep or not. But other even more severe and significant restrictions to the civil rights granted by the Constitution were also put in place, especially on the right to vote. Now, while voting rights could not be restricted on the basis of race, they could require a proof of literacy, which many former slaves obviously didn't have because they didn't have an education. People were also occasionally needed to prove that the grandfather had been able to vote, and once again, it was a measure clearly aimed at stopping the slaves from voting. The issue of voting restrictions on the black community is actually still a pretty huge problem in America, so look it up. Last but not least, we are talking about the carpetbaggers, so the people who moved from the north to the south after the Civil War. They worked as teachers, administrators, or missionaries. The origins of the term are actually pretty simple. Carpetbags, bags made of carpet, were for some reason fashionable in the north at the time and were seen as a bizarre accessory by the southerners, hence the name. I also think carpetbags are a bizarre accessory. These carpetbaggers, had two simple goals: rebuild the South and make a ton of money out of it. They were often seen as corrupt, money-hungry foreigners who took advantage of the crisis of the South in order to enrich themselves and work together with the hated soldier left there by the winners. And in all fairness, they were in many cases corrupt, money-hungry foreigners who wanted to enrich themselves. And this didn't really help give the winners of the Civil War, didn't help them win the hearts and mind of the new subjects, in a way, of their former co-citizens, of the defeated ones. So, those were the essential facts. I tried to keep everything as short as possible, and this is why I will not read the model answer today, because it's 20 minutes already, but you can read everything in the transcript. I'm actually looking to read your answers, and well, again, this would have been 2 lessons under normal circumstances, so I think it was pretty good. That said, have a good day and show me what you can do.